Muito bem. Café deve estar muito bom, que o povo preferiu ficar lá. Tive que tirar a comida, senão. Muito obrigado, então, por terem retornado. Eu volto a anunciar novamente, então, para mim, particularmente, é um motivo de satisfação ter aqui o Lincoln e a Dália, com quem eu tenho trabalhado na Duke University em 2016, novembro do ano passado. Tenho sido convidado lá, temos projetos em conjunto, inclusive com a Universidade Nacional de Assunción, que está aqui o Victório, sobre Itaipu e outras coisas mais, de maneira que essa última sessão aqui tem esse caráter especial, pelo menos para mim. Então, e também teremos, depois do Lincoln, a Dália, e para encerrar, vamos revisar como a Califórnia construiu um sistema regulatório e legal. E, felizmente, o Ethan Elkind pôde está aqui acompanhando e vai nos relatar. Ele que dirigiu o estudo de avaliação disso lá na Califórnia. Ele é advogado, então vai nos dar a parte que vai ser importante aqui na área de regulação. Lincoln, the floor is yours for about half an hour, whatever you want. Since we are till midnight.
No, I will definitely keep it to a half an hour, and I want to thank Professor Sauer for having me here. It's a real honor to be a participant in such a fantastic meeting. And I also want to apologize. I'm woefully incapable of speaking any other language than English, so I will be speaking English, and for the sake of the poor translators who have done a phenomenal job through this, I will try and not go too fast because I don't have a lot of words on my slide. So like Professor Pino, I actually, based on the talks from yesterday and today, ended up revising my talk a little bit to focus in on a particular aspect of the economics of energy storage. And it's going to be analyzing California's proposed Clean Peak Standard. This is a project I've been doing with Ziting, Ananya, and Lena, three Masters of Environmental Management candidates in our program at the Nicholas School. And we've been working on it over the past several months. So this is still a work that's in prep, and you're going to be seeing some preliminary results here. So, before I define what the Clean Peak Standard is and why it's been proposed, I need to give you some context, starting with the generation in California. So relative to Brazil, California has about half the generating capacity. And then with respect to the other components of types of generators, California really has a fraction of the hydro, about half the wind as Brazil, a quarter of nuclear. We have about 1.5 times the thermal generation in the state, but where the real difference is in solar. It's about 49 times more solar currently in California than there is here in Brazil. And the entity that is responsible for managing the integration of this solar into the grid is largely the responsibility of the California Independent System Operator, or CAISO. CAISO consists of the three major investor-owned utilities in the state, and basically, go back, manages all of this area that you see in yellow, which as we heard yesterday, represents about, it's the scheduling, about 80% of the generation and pretty much all of the transmission in the state. Now, this is a typical day in the CAISO about a year ago, March 1st, 2017, and the top figure that you see here is the amount of renewable energy generated over the course of that day. You can see that it includes geothermal, biomass, biogas, small hydro, and wind, but the vast majority of it is solar. Now, as you're well aware, this is non-dispatchable, so they treat it as a reduction in the total load, which is represented by this black line that you see. So you're left with this dashed line, which is the net load that has to be met, in this case, by nuclear, large hydro, thermal, and imports from outside of the state. Now, this net load curve, as Dr. Mooney mentioned in yesterday's talk, has been changing rapidly, giving rise to the duck curve that you've heard about repeatedly. And this is a depiction of essentially the net load curve between 2011 and 2017 for an average day in March. And you can see that over the course of these 6 years, the midday load, net load, has dropped by some 10 gigawatts. As a result, you have a 7 gigawatt ramp down from the early morning hours to the midday, and then a 10 gigawatt ramp up from midday till about 10 o'clock at night. Now, this 10 gigawatt drop in net load in midday is a consequence of just 15% increase in renewable energy since 2011, between 2011 and 2017. And this renewable energy is projected to grow. We'll talk more about this in a minute. But one of the side effects of this evolving duck curve has been an increase in the curtailment of wind and solar energy. So what you're looking at here is curtailments of wind and solar in 2015, 16, and 17. This is the total curtailment in terms of megawatt hours in each of these years. The percentages, however, represent the total curtailment relative to the total load over these 3 years. And what I want you to notice is that curtailment has increased 7-fold in just those 3-year period. Now, what you're seeing here today is likely to be amplified given California's goals moving forward. And there's two major ones at play here. The first is that California already has 30% on average renewable energy as a fraction of the load that's generated. And the goal is to reach 33% by 2020 and 50% by 2030. At the same time, as part of the state's plan to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions 40% below 1990 levels, it is planning to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions from the electric sector by 50% since 2015. So these are very aggressive goals that are driving a lot of the change that you see happening in the state. Now, the California Public Utility Commission, in its Integrated Resource Plan for 2017, has kind of projected how they're going to try and meet these goals while also meeting a 10% increase in generation. In load. And that is by essentially more than doubling the amount of solar that's currently, that was current in 2017, and essentially increasing wind by the same amount that they decrease the thermal generation. So if we take, not knowing what the future holds, of course, if we take essentially the load and generation in 2017 and essentially scale it up to the 2030 projection, so increase the load by 10%, double the amount of solar, reduce the thermal by some 20%, increase the wind by 20%, we end up with this set of curves that you see here. So the gray line is the total load. The blue line that you see represents the reduction in this total load by the deployment of more solar, behind the meter solar. So this is solar that's used on site. So this is solar that does not need to be generated by the utilities. And then this yellow curve that you see would be the in front of the meter solar, the amount of solar that would presumably be sold. So if you take this yellow curve and subtract it from this blue curve, this is what your net profile looks like, which is quite exaggerated. Right? You see that rather than a ramp down of 7 gigawatts, we're now ramping down over 21 gigawatts. And rather than increasing 10, we're ramping up 30. And clearly, this type of setup would cause all sorts of problems. I mean, you would have these very large ramp rates without some way of, other than thermal to dispatch the power to meet the ramp rates, will increase the greenhouse gas emissions during this time. which kind of offsets what they're trying to do with their emissions. And at the same time, if you have an inflexible level of load, your curtailments could rise from a fraction of a percent of the total load to some 10 to 20% of the total load. So, so this is the challenge that California is facing in trying to meet its goals. And which brings me to the Clean Peak Standard, which is the proposal for how to potentially deal with this. In this proposal, the idea is that you would take essentially clean energy from earlier in the day and dispatch it during a period. A lot of times this is viewed as a 4-hour period. Here I'm showing it as a 5-hour period. We've been looking at it in terms of dispatching clean energy between essentially 5 o'clock at night to 10 o'clock at night. And this clean energy has to represent 40% of the total load that you see up here. Okay. And yet it needs to happen over this kind of what I'll refer to as Clean Peak Standard hours. Now, this type of proposal is well suited for energy storage because this type of storage is perfect for load shifting. You can basically store energy that might have been curtailed as well as that is produced during times of low demand and then discharge it again during the Clean Peak Standard hours. Now, one of the things I want you to notice with this proposal, however, is that during these Clean Peak Standard hours, you still have renewable energy that's being generated. That's the gap between the blue curve and the orange curve. So the 40% of clean energy that needs to be met, some of it will be met by renewable energy. So that reduces the amount that has to happen from storage. Now we can take the 2017 curve and make an estimate of what the storage needs would be across the year. So what you're looking at here, the black line, is the total load projected for 2030 from 2017 just during the clean peak hours, just between 5 and 10 o'clock at night. Okay? And that's for every day in the year, the total amount of energy during that period. And the dashed or dotted black line represents 40% of that total energy. The yellow region that you see is the renewable energy that is generated during those clean peak hours, during that 5 to 10 o'clock window. So the difference between this dotted black line and the yellow region represents the amount of energy storage that you would estimate to need to meet that 40% clean energy standard on any one given day. Now, one of the things I want you to notice is that there are days when no storage is needed. In other words, you're going to meet the 40% just by renewable energy. But as we'll see, that doesn't address the more amplified dip in the middle of the day. So you're still left with that issue. Now, one of the things, kind of the main reasons behind this seasonal variation in the amount of energy storage that's needed has to do with essentially the amount and shape of the load as well as the amount and shape of the resource. So in these graphs, the top is total load, the middle is wind and solar estimated for these days, and the bottom is the difference between the two, the net load. And the blue curve represents winter, yellow summer, fall is the brownish, and green is spring. And what I want you to notice is that the net load curve is at its worst when essentially the load is low. You have peaks for demand in the early morning hours due to cooling, being needed for heating and light. And then again in the early evening hours as people come home. And when essentially your resource is very large and extends into the early evening hours. So for example, if we look at spring, this is a time when you have a net load curve which would effectively, for this 2030 projection, which again is a significant estimate, you would basically be generating more energy than was required by the entire grid. And if we go back, one of the things I want you to notice, this underscores what I was just trying to say, April is right in this region. So you would basically be generating all of that with meeting your Clean Peak standard with renewable energy. So storage would not be helping you under these particular conditions. Now we can take this curve and essentially create a cumulative histogram of how much storage would be needed for any fraction of the year. And that's what you're looking at in this graph right here, the orange. So here's the amount of storage. Here's the fraction of the year that it would be needed on the left, what you see here. Now, what I want you to notice is yesterday when we were hearing from Dr. Gravely about the mandate for storage in California, he mentioned that the mandate is a historic almost 2 gigawatt level. Well, here's the 2 gigawatts versus what would potentially be needed, ultimately 35 gigawatts, to meet the Clean Peak standard, if you did it by storage, for the day when the most storage is needed. Right? The other thing that I want to point out here is that the inverse of this orange curve effectively represents the capacity factor for the different levels of storage. And you can see that at low levels of storage, essentially you would be using it about 2/3 of the year. But clearly, as you go to high levels of storage, you drop to 1% or less. Now, typically what you would have in a situation like this, in order to bring this sort of storage on, is that you would need to either have very high very high prices to to deploy this storage, and/or have very low cost for the storage, so that you get a profit for having the storage online for the little time of the year that you would use it. The quandary, however, with this is that right now storage costs are relatively high, yet as we saw in the talks from yesterday, the little that we know about PPAs involving storage are remarkably low. So, for example, we heard about the PPA for Kauai with AES at about $111 per megawatt hour. This is for a battery system that has a capacity of 20 megawatts and energy capacity of 100 megawatts for about an equivalent size solar system. That was in January of 2017. In May 2017, NextEra signed this PPA with Tucson Electric, which we also heard about yesterday, at less than $45 a megawatt hour, which they estimate without subsidies is probably more like $90 a megawatt hour. Again, we have a 100 megawatt solar plant, 50 megawatt battery with 120 megawatt hour energy capacity. And then more recently, just last month, First Solar and APS signed a PPA for a 65 megawatt solar plant with a battery that had a 50 megawatt capacity and a 200 megawatt battery. Now, what's interesting about this contract, which is for 15 years, and we don't know what the price is, but supposedly it's competitive with this price here, is that this system will deliver 50 megawatts every hour over a 4-hour period. In other words, basically this charge for over this energy capacity. Right? So it's very much like the Clean Peak standard, and in fact this Clean Peak standard was first kind of proposed and implemented or is in the process of trying to be implemented in Arizona. So this is happening elsewhere besides California. Now, one of the big reasons why these PPAs are so low for the storage plus solar is because of the PPAs that solar are receiving. You can see here that as of last year, this is produced by Lawrence Livermore, Lawrence Berkeley Labs, their annual assessment of PPAs for the solar industry. You can see that they're basically at the kind of 3 cent per kilowatt hour level, quite remarkably low rather. And so what I'm going to try and do in the remainder of this talk is isolate what the PPA would need to be for the battery. And I'm going to do this with a very simple IRR analysis in which I'm going to essentially vary the PPA rate and the costs. Those will be the two numbers that I change. And I'm just going to basically calculate a cash flow and the subsequent IRR based on the revenue earned by the storage, given the PPA, adjusted for just simply O&M costs and taking into account depreciation and taxes. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is you'll notice that in this simple cash flow, which goes out 10 years, that for the first 6 years, you're essentially losing money. Here's your net income. It's negative. Now, the way that wind and solar has worked in the United States and why these PPAs are so low is that these losses actually can be used as what they call a tax shield to offset a business's costs. And so a lot of times you have very large investors that have a high tax bill that will essentially be part of these wind and solar farms and take advantage of this credit. And so that is a cash inflow that gets monetized. For batteries, aside from the standard depreciation, there are no special incentives like the production tax credit or the investment tax credit. So the point I'm trying to make here is that it's harder to make the economics work for just storage. So what I'm going to show you next, this is a rather complicated graph, and I'll try and walk you through it. These are the results of my sensitivity analysis. So here is the installed cost in dollars per kilowatt hour, varying between $500 and $300. And there's the PPA price, basically varying between $50 and $150. The colors that you see represent the IRR for these costs and PPA, with the contours represented. I'm trying to highlight that. I'm sorry if things get kind of hard to see. But the main thing I want you to note is this red line. This is a 0% IRR. So effectively, this is where essentially your revenue balances your costs at a 0% discount rate, right? So everything to the right of this, you start to have a discount rate that goes up. Everything to the left of this, you wouldn't want to, there's going to be no positive return. Now, on top of this, I've put the range that Lazard, a major consulting firm that publishes on the cost of levelized cost of energy, what they estimate to be the installed cost for storage as of 2017. Now, when this came out, I'm sure costs have gone lower, and in talking with Dr. Mooney, we discussed that these prices are probably a bit lower, but keep this in mind as a kind of a cost range where at least in the public, where we think storage is at. Then on top of that, I've plotted these lines representing essentially what the PPA was in Kauai. That's $111 per megawatt hour. And here's the PPA without subsidies in Tucson, and it may be lower than this. And this is the mean CAISO price. And so in this particular analysis, the IRRs are based on discharging the storage only during the Clean Peak standard hours. So that's the only time that the storage is earning revenue. There is no cost for the electricity because the electricity is coming from, in this instance, a solar system, right? So they have zero cost to charge the battery, and then they discharge it and get this sort of revenue. So you can see that under these conditions, it's very hard, given these PPAs, to get an IRR that would be positive. So there's got to be an additional way to earn money here. And various ways have been looked at. We can talk more about those later, things like demand charge, using the storage for demand response. What I've done is to just also look at whether or not you could use the storage to arbitrage the hourly price. So what you're looking at here, I've got a 5 megawatt system that can discharge and charge at 1 megawatt. And so in the early morning hours, when prices are low, the battery stores, and then it discharges during that ramp down. And then it charges again when it's low, and discharges during the clean peak standard hours when it's supposed to discharge. And at this point, it's actually receiving that PPA price. Otherwise, it's receiving what the price of the market has. Under these conditions, when I rerun the analysis, this 0% IRR line now shifts to the left. Now, this is for 10 years. If I redo the analysis and extend the time period for the investment to 20 years over 10 years, everything in this graph now becomes positive. So I think the bottom line that I'm trying to leave you with here is that it's extremely hard to make it be economic for storage just using it to meet the clean peak standard. There has to be another way that you earn income. The problem here is that a couple of things that I'll mention in closing. One is that in the arbitrage case that I just showed you, you basically don't have a guarantee that you're going to make that particular price. And a lot of these contracts that essentially financial arrangements for making these large wind farms, including the ones with storage, require some sort of fixed revenue. That's why the PPA is there. And so I'm not sure that the arbitrage that I modeled here really fits the needed financial model. The second thing is that as we move forward, the storage is likely going to have to be added to only new PV. And the reason for this is because a lot of the existing solar systems that have been set up have received much higher PPAs in the past than are being offered right now. And if they try and renegotiate the PPA to include storage, they're not going to get this high price. It's going to be somewhere down here. And so all of this addition of storage is probably going to have to come from new solar. And then the final thing that I'll mention is these very low costs you see here are for projects that cost it out. The point I'm trying to make is that these are locations where they're building the PV systems that there's a very good solar resource. And between that, the revenue from that resource and the investment tax credit that the solar farms receive, the economics work out. It doesn't mean that you can plop a PV system down anywhere and be able to generate economically viable returns at these levels. All right, and finally, I'll mention that a lot of this has been driven, as I said, by these extra tax credits, the investment tax credits, and those which were at 30% of the initial cost of the solar system are essentially being phased down. So for commercial solar, they're dropping from a 30% investment tax credit to a 10% investment tax credit. And what that basically means is this is going to be very hard moving forward, unless the cost for solar continue to decline, to be able to build new solar plants that operate at these very low PPAs. So with that, I'll stop there. And obrigado.
Thank you, Lincoln. Now I have the privilege to invite Professor Dalia Patino Echeverri, also of the Nicholas School of Environment of Duke University.